Classics Confidential. I'm talking with Susan Deacy at the beautiful campus of the University of Roehampton in South London. Thank you for talking with us, Susan. We're in the beautiful Grove House, a Georgian building, and we're actually going to be talking about this chimney piece behind us. So tell us about your research and what you have discovered about this interesting chimney piece.
Oh, certainly, certainly. Well, firstly, thank you so much for coming here and agreeing to film in the room known as the Adam Room. I'll say a little bit why it's called that, etc., etc. Okay, my key research interests are religion and mythology in ancient Greece, particularly the goddess Athena, and my second favourite mythological topic, on which I've also written, is Heracles / Hercules. So I'm very interested in mythology. I'm also interested in gender and sexuality in the ancient world. And my interest in Athena and Heracles has very much enabled me to bridge my two key research interests. And then about 10 years ago, I started work here at Roehampton University, and I was absolutely blown away to discover that in my workplace there was a representation of the myth of Hercules on this beautiful chimney piece panel behind us, where Hercules is making his choice between two paths, the path of, well, in ancient Greek terms, virtue and vice, arete and kakeia. And in 18th century terms, okay, this is, as you said a little earlier, an 18th century reception of the classical world. In 18th century terms, in this sort of English version of the myth that was so popular in the Georgian period, he's making his choice between hard work and pleasure, indolence, something like that. I suppose it's duty and pleasure rather than sort of virtue, necessarily virtue and vice, although those connotations are there. Now, so there's a Hercules / Heracles figure in my workplace, which I could not believe I was discovering when I was first in this room for a training session in about 2004 or 2005. Also, the figure of virtue is an Athena-esque figure. So it was as if everything in my teaching and research, everything in my life as an academia seemed to have been leading me unknowingly to this room in Roehampton University. What I found I was looking for, what I was aware I was looking for over the years, was a route into the study of the reception of the classical world. Not least because one of the things that interested me in the figure of Athena, going back 20-25 years ago now, was the way in which she was an intriguing figure from the ancient Greek world, but she was also all around us. There are modern Athenas in a range of modern cities. And I was fortunate enough to work in Vienna for a semester a few years ago on a guest professorship. And one of the things that made me so excited about working there is that it's a site of it's an Athena-esque theme park, quite apart from anything else. So what working at Roehampton has given me is the routine I was looking for to a research engagement with classical reception. So one of the things I've been doing, for example, is thinking about ways in which the vocabulary of classical reception that Lorna Hardwick devised can be applied to this representation. And it's made me feel like I'm kind of at a crossroad. That was very appropriate as Heracles is choosing between two paths here in this representation. I wonder whether I'm at a kind of crossroads myself, sorry for using the myth of Hercules here as a paradigm for my own academic journey. But one thing that I'm struck by is when studying classical reception, well, when studying this particular representation, how far am I doing it as a classicist, tracing the mythological journey of the myth of Heracles, Hercules, from the ancient world through its post-classical afterlife, or how far should I be looking at this representation as an 18th century historian?
Yes, and that's always, of course, the choice that everyone working in reception faces. How much are you looking back towards the ancient source, and how much are you engaging with the receiving culture?
Yes, absolutely. Because I'm aware what we have here is an 18th century reception of a classical myth, but also that what the makers of this panel, it is made by the Carter workshop, what they were very much able to do was engage with, in some sense, present what's meant to be looking like a copy of something classical, and yet what it also is very much an instance of 18th century English myth-making. So is this a Greek myth being received in the 18th century, or is this the 18th century using Greek antiquity in order to reflect on various aspects of English culture? For example, Heracles, well, I should say Hercules, okay, as it's post-classical. Hercules is turning his body towards pleasure, indolent, Venus, I suppose, and all the very immediate pleasures associated with her, but he's turning his head towards virtue, hard work, industry, Minerva, however one wants to conceptualize her. This Athena-esque figure carries a sword. She's pointing up the steep rocky path that Hercules will need to travel if he chooses her particular way. There's also a helmet with a serpent on top of it on the ground behind her, which is the most sort of obviously Athena-esque feature here. So he's turning his face towards her, but his body towards pleasure, etc. So he hasn't yet made his choice, he's deliberating. And of course, one thing that strikes me is that Hercules never really finally makes a choice, he always does both. He lives the life of pleasure, he lives the life of hard work. So he's always caught, I suppose he's always caught.
Eternally,
yes,
in between
exactly.
those two choices.
As I can be between being a classicist and an 18th century historian, I suppose. But what you've also got here, as well as the ancient Greek choice of Heracles between virtue and vice being deliberated upon, what you've also got is a very 18th century conceptualization being represented here between, for example, industry and indolence, industry and pleasure, a duality much beloved of 18th century Protestant England. But what you also have is another duality beloved of the 18th century, namely the mind-body opposition. And of course what we also have here is a lot of Christianizing representation and allegory as well. Very often in representations of the virtue figure, there are Virgin Mary-esque representations here. This one, I guess, is more towards the Minerva side of things than Virgin Mary, although that sort of Christian, that Christianizing way of looking at the choice and using Hercules as this kind of uber Christian man needing to make his choice between mind, body, etc., is also coming into play here.
And of course, I mean, one has to think about the viewer of, the 18th century viewer. We, of course, see more classical elements, but would they have also seen perhaps more of the Christian elements than we do today?
Yes, absolutely. Another thing that strikes me about this panel is that it would look very much at home in this room that was very possibly a dining room. So most of the furniture could have been moved aside for dining, dancing, etc., etc. But this chimney piece would always have been here. So its iconography needs to be. It is particularly significant because it's always going to be a focal point. And so I guess what you have then is something archetypally, quintessentially classical, but for the English climate and obviously in a chimney piece setting. So as well as being, so on one level it would have been very much at home here, and also the villa owners would have had their various classical antiquities brought back from the Grand Tour on show here. So it's very much, it would be very much in keeping with its neoclassical setting. It would be very much, you know, a showpiece aspect of that neoclassical setting. However, it also looks artificial. The panel looks very much sort of stuck on. It looks like it's meant to be seen as something that's part of the chimney piece, but also different from it, transplanted here, out of place almost in the context of the chimney piece. Although one thing that also interests me, sorry I interrupted.
I was about to ask, do you think that this idea of transplanting antiquity in 18th century culture is something more general, or, you know, maybe not something that just refers to this particular panel?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You've got this very interesting blend between the 18th century making the classical world very much its own. So classical culture is very much seen as part of and owned by 18th century elites.
And these sort of rooms in
yes.
you know, 18th century houses were like showcases
exactly.
of ownership in a way.
Exactly. But you have also got this sense of otherness and foreignness and difference. And I find that interplay absolutely fascinating. And I suppose it's also a duality that's key to classical myth and its post-classical reception, whereby classical figures are, the most popular mythological figures are everyman or everywoman figures, but they also have an otherness and difference about them as well.
Which is part of the attraction.
It is, exactly. And it's why Heracles was so adaptable and flexible and popular and an everyman in classical antiquity, and why he has this status at key periods since antiquity, right up to the modern period as well.
You actually managed to forestall my next question, which was precisely why was Hercules so appealing?
Yes.
And why has he remained so over the centuries?
Absolutely, exactly.
And you organised, co-organised an event at the Institute of Classical Studies called Hercules, A Hero for All Ages, which kind of encapsulates that. That idea, really.
Yes, exactly. He's greater than humans, he's extraordinary, he attains immortality. The whole point of him is that he's excessive, he's different. He crosses boundaries that we ordinary people are not supposed to cross. Man, God, man, animal, man, woman, etc., etc. But at the same time, he also stands for what it is to be human. He encapsulates the human condition. And I think Athena is a comparable kind of figure, which is why so often in ancient representations, and also in post-classical reception, the two of them are interacting with one another as they are on a certain level here. And another thing that blew me away when I started to research this representation in earnest about 2 years ago, was how far the viewer of this representation is, I think, being invited to themselves enact, re-enact, work through themselves the choice or judgment of Hercules. This is this is how I got to this hypothesis, if I can quite call it that yet. At Stourhead, where the representation of Hercules in an 18th century landscape garden context is very key. It has been argued, and I think very convincingly, that what the viewer is what the visitor to the garden is invited to do when they leave the pantheon, where a representation of Hercules stands between a virtue-like figure and a vice-like figure. The visitor is then able to leave the pantheon, and then they get very quickly to a fork in the road, where they can choose a nice easy path to the artificially constructed village and its pub, or they can climb up a steep path, the way of virtue then, where there will be different kind of reward of a beautiful view over the garden from the Temple of Apollo. Now, on this chimney piece, I would say something comparable is going on, because as well as having the choice of Hercules represented in the centre here, I think that it also continues to either side of the chimney piece. Because on the side of vice, pleasure, indolence here, right at the end, you have the tendrils and grapes of pleasure, whereas over the other side, when you turn around here, what you have is, well, just as you have a helmet on the ground here, there's a helmet at the end, just as you have Hercules' lion's head, the head from his lion skin, draped over his club here. Here you have the lion wearing the helmet. So I guess what you've got here is what happens if you choose pleasure, and what happens, the rewards of the arduous climb to the top of the hill, etc., etc. So I wonder whether the visitor to this room, warming themselves by the fireplace, eating their dinner, dancing, etc., etc., is also invited to not just look at this beautiful work of art, but also position themselves as this everyman figure who can enact their own version of the 18th century choice between duty, pleasure, hard work, indolence, etc., etc.
Susan, thank you so much for talking to us about this wonderful interactive piece of art here in Roehampton. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for coming. It's been lovely to be able to talk about my most favourite object in the whole world.
Excellent.